Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bolton of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about. Artificial intelligence could change our elections, our economy, and our lives. The applications for AI are virtually unlimited and changing by the day. It was hard for me to imagine how government was going to keep up. Hard until I talked with New York Assemblymember Alex Bores. Alex is a computer scientist who's easily one of the most thoughtful people talking about AI. He's also written some smart legislation in the area. I talked to him about how he thinks we should plan for AI, why he walked away from startups and wealth to engage in public service, and how the Democratic Party is or isn't prepared for the future. Enjoy. New York Assemblymember Alex Bores, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Thanks for having me.
I want to jump in. You've had a busy session from everything from restaurant fees to AI to judges, everything that's going on in your state. Can you give us a little overview of how this session both went and then also felt?
This was a really exciting session, but also one that had plenty of twists and turns. So the New York legislature, I think like most state legislatures, are on 2-year terms. And so you can often think about what happens in the odd number years and the even number years. And historically, maybe we haven't always taken as big a swing on certain policy issues in the even number years because people are thinking about what's awaiting them for in the primaries or in November. But this year, we took a number of substantial swings. We put together a housing proposal that will substantially expand housing in the state over the next 10 years, which I was really excited by. That came together in the budget. We also, given the deadline we had at the end of the year in the 2024 elections, did a lot around protecting our elections from artificial intelligence and from other threats. Two of the bills that passed were my bills that I was really excited to get forward. We took the first step to expand the number of judges in New York State because we saw that our trials were supremely delayed and needed ways to actually get people speedy trials and fair justice. And as you referenced, perhaps a more fun bill, if not as weighty as the others, was we saw this weird practice of websites springing up encouraging people to make reservations and sell them, which made it a lot harder to go to restaurants unless you're willing to pay $500, $1,000, $1,500 just for a reservation. And so we quickly wrote a bill and passed in order to ban that practice and keep your family dinner safe.
I want to jump right in to some of that AI work that you talked about. You are a computer scientist. That is rare in any legislative body, but increasingly important as we look at how AI will potentially fundamentally change whole sections of our economy but also elections. So I want to talk about the role of AI in the economy, but I want to first talk about the role of AI in the elections as we are coming up on the most consequential election of our lifetime, and it could also be the election where AI is deployed in some harmful ways. Tell us how you start to think about the problem, and then where you end up and where you hope we go.
The first thing to think about with AI, which I tell everyone, is that this technology is going to move faster than any technology that has come before, and so I can tell you how I'm thinking about it right now. And by the time, 2 episodes down in this podcast, but I'm saying we'll be out of date. So we have to remain flexible, and that isn't always well aligned with the legislative process, which is intentionally deliberative with a lot of checks and balances. And so I think a lot about how we can lay frameworks that we can build upon and will continue to last versus maybe spanning specific uses of AI or specific instances, because we'll never be able to keep up. However, when it comes to elections, we had a really pressing deadline coming up, and this isn't a theoretical example anymore. Last fall, Slovakia had national elections where the leading candidate, there was a deep fake recording of him released where he was talking about rigging the election, and more damningly, where he was said to be planning to raise the price of beer. Obviously, it was a completely fake recording, but it was released so close to the election and got a lot of news coverage. And that leading candidate ended up losing by just a few percentage points. And so we've already seen AI actually have an effect and arguably swing an election. And we knew we didn't want to have that here in the US and specifically in New York. And so I put forward 2 bills, both of which were passed as part of the budget. One required that campaigns that use generative AI, that create really realistic representations, have to disclose it. You have to label your video, you have to label your image, you have to actually read out a disclosure if it's a recording or a radio ad that says, this is synthetic media, this was made this was made with certain technology, et cetera. But additionally, much of the worst behavior isn't coming directly from the campaigns. And so we needed a way to regulate the other aspects that were out there. And we empowered the courts in New York to issue injunctive relief. So if anyone makes a deep fake of a candidate, the candidates themselves can sue. And we've empowered the courts to have expedited review and actually to issue an injunction to pull down any of that fake media. And this has 2 benefits. A, hopefully we're getting the fake information off the airways. But B, there's this flip side of the coin where now that there are deep fakes, sometimes real video or real recordings, you'll have candidates say, oh no, that's made up, that was generated by AI. But now we have a process to say, okay, prove it. If you're saying this is AI, why are you not going to court? Why are you not getting the injunctive relief? And so it's going to help us both pull down the things that are fake, but also verify the recordings that are actually true.
Interesting. Can you talk, AI is obviously a global phenomenon. And we have different states taking different approaches. In some ways, it's a perfect laboratories of democracy. In other ways, you could imagine that's a very patchwork way to deal with a global phenomenon. How do you think, when you're talking about these frameworks, of the role of states in regulating AI?
It's mixed. So I think about 3 different levels of where states are getting involved, right? The first, which will always be true, is how states themselves are using AI. AI comes with many threats, and we need to think about that, and especially when it comes to bias and some of the immediate impacts that we're seeing. But it also comes with opportunities, perhaps ways to better provide services to our constituents, to get them information quicker, to help them navigate bureaucracy, to get them information in their language and in their context that otherwise we haven't been providing. And so we need to think about how states themselves are using AI. In New York, we did a lot with that this year. I'll talk about in a sec. The second place is where AI intersects with the areas that states will always have dominion over. So the US Constitution allows individual states to regulate their own elections. So nothing at the federal level, even if they passed a big bill about AI, that would only apply to Congress and presidential races. We still have to think about the state and local races. And that also applies to most employment regulation is done at the state level, et cetera. And so how AI intersects with those fields, states will be taking the lead in. And then there's that third category of things that are probably properly done at the federal level, but the federal has not always done as much as we would hope, or not moved as fast as we would like. And so you'll see a number of the states, California is pushing a bill this week. Colorado passed the first protection from AI and consumer affairs just a few weeks ago. You saw Connecticut take a lead there. And obviously in New York, we have a number of bills as well, where maybe that will continue to happen at the state level, much like privacy legislation is still happening at the state level. But maybe eventually we'll see the federal government catch up and provide a federal standard for everyone to operate within.
Let's talk about that first use case of government employing AI. And on one hand, seems like the perfect scenario because government has so much data, it's public, so you can feed it into the models. We're trying to provide services. There's never enough resources to provide all the services we want. And in some cases, some of the services we provide are difficult for people, the people we work for, to access. On the other hand, government is conservative and in sort of culture and in new technologies, and is maybe particularly worried about some of the unintended consequences or intended consequences of this legislation. What's the best way for governments to leverage this new technology in ways that are good and politically possible, and avoid some of the pitfalls?
Well, I'll tell you a few that we're doing in New York, but I think the exciting thing is that there's many more to be discovered. And we want people building up their competence in AI. We want our government workers learning about this technology because they're going to come up with lots of ways of using it that we wouldn't have even thought of. But some of the obvious ones have been, anyone who's had the experience of calling a government agency and being on hold for 3-4 hours. This happened to me when I called the IRS a few years ago, and I was literally on hold for 4 hours. There are going to be complicated cases where you absolutely need to talk to a human. I'm not saying that AI will ever replace actually government workers answering the phone, but maybe there are some easier cases that a chatbot could help screen and knock out and give quick answers to, so that people with complicated cases can get through on the line quicker, right? That would end up benefiting everyone. You also have in New York, we did something called Empire AI, which was realizing that there's a lot of exciting research happening in AI, but it's expensive. And so it tends to be dominated by the big tech companies. And that's, they're doing really innovative things, but they have their own incentives. And if we want to ensure that perhaps our researchers, especially our public universities, can run the experiments that they want and move the frontier of what's possible forward, we need to find a way to make the cost of that research cheaper. And so the state put up a little money up front, and we got some private money as well. And we bought a large amount of AI computer chips, what are called GPUs, and are spinning up a large data center that New York researchers will be able to use to do research into mitigating bias, to do research into AI safety, to do research into any of the many ways we can serve New Yorkers. But we'll be able to do it for far less than if we were renting that space from a cloud computing provider. And so not only do we get the benefits of the research, it becomes a way to recruit really talented researchers to come to New York, because your federal grant will go a lot further if it's cheaper to do research here, which means also our students in New York are getting a better education, and a lot of that research will end up being spun off and being new companies. And so it'll be an economic boost in New York. And so that was a particularly innovative way, I think, where we have gone headfirst into thinking about AI that ends up helping the entire economy and the education system as well.
Tell me about the conversations. I mean, that's super smart. Tell me about some of the conversations within the legislature. You're rare as a computer science expert, and also just frankly your age. And so when you're trying to engage folks to talk about the challenges and opportunities that come from AI or any other technology, what's your strategy and how does that go?
Humility is a big part of it, as I think we all should have that strategy. It's really important for a legislature to have many diverse life experiences and views and knowledge and where people came from. And so we need young people, we need older people, we need people that know computer science, and we need people that know everything else. In the New York State legislature, we also have someone who's a pharmacist. And if we're passing any bill that affects pharmacies, obviously we ask him for expertise of what it's like on the ground. That doesn't mean we're all going to vote exactly the way he will, but we want to get that life experience and that knowledge. And so it's similar when it comes to tech, right? It's not that all my colleagues are going to agree with me on exactly what I want to do with everything in technology, but I've established that, not only do I have the technical expertise, but I've worked in the field. So I can think about how the companies are approaching this as well. And that can be really collaborative because I can work with colleagues that are saying, this is how it's affecting my constituents or how it's affecting my neighbors in a way that isn't coming directly to me. But I can say, let's work together on how we can change what's happening in the tech space. You're bringing knowledge from your constituents that I don't have, and I'm bringing knowledge of the technology. So being, I think, open to those conversations and also respectful of what everyone else is bringing to it, and knowing the algorithms is a very small part of passing a bill and having an impact on our constituents.
Do you get called in a lot to help people like fix their Zoom calls or update their software packages?
I do. But I think that would happen regardless because of my age and not just because I am the first Democrat elected in New York State at any level with a degree in computer science. But certainly that combination leads to a few requests for fixing iPhones, which I happily oblige with.
That's a good way to build relationships, and probably much easier than the people who are approaching the pharmacist about things. So let's talk. Graduating with a computer science degree and really understanding this, that's a ticket to make a lot of money in the industry. But you've chosen to engage on it from the public service side. Talk about that decision and why you've chosen to be on the legislative side rather than on the venture side or the startup side or where there's other opportunities.
It's all about where you can have impact, and you can have impact in a lot of different ways. You can do that through building a new company that provides a innovative new service. And I worked in the private sector. I worked in tech, including in multiple startups for the first 10 years of my career. But ultimately, when you work in government, you can sort of set the incentives and the structures that will continue to help people. And when you're working in New York State, you get to pass laws that help 20 million people. And that is a pretty incredible opportunity to lean in towards. I remember when my seat first became open, I had a conversation with a retired assembly member who was prolific. He had passed over 200 laws in his 20 years in the chamber, and he had retired a while ago. I made a point of talking to someone, out of the game, as they say, just for, how do you think about the impact you have? How do you think about your experiences? And he said, he has those 200 laws, but he has 3 bills in particular that are printed out on his desk drawer to this day. And when he's having a bad day, he takes them out and he reads them, and he just reminds himself that he did something. And that moment has stuck with me, right? That is the high I'm chasing. And in government is just an incredible opportunity to deliver that. And the last thing I would say on why government actually comes a little bit from a political ideology, but as a Democrat, right, I believe government can be a force for good, but that also gives us the burden of proving it. And it's not enough to say philosophically government can be good. I think it's right for Republicans to turn around and say, well, it's not working here, it's not working there. And you have a lot of those stories out there, but I truly believe it can be. And so being in government and actually doing that good, I think is an important part of living up to the ideology and putting our walking the walk, I should say, not just talking the talk.
How does that experience in the private sector and in startups translate or not translate into campaigns and service?
It translates quite a bit, actually, because first of all, a startup, much like a campaign, is do or die. You have short timeframes and you have to produce results. And also you never have enough resources, you never have enough time, you never have enough staff. And that's similar across both. And so going into a campaign where you never have enough resources or time or staff, but you really need to get results, right? You have this very public declaration at the end of a campaign as to who won and who lost. And so being able to think innovatively about getting your message out there is definitely something I took away from my time in startups.
So tell us about that first campaign. The seat's open. You talk to the former assembly member, get a sense of why it may all be worth it. How do you take that to victory?
Well, it was a long series of conversations. First and foremost with my family. You never run for office by yourself. Whoever is your family is part of that journey as well. And mine was very supportive and very excited. I was running where I was born and raised, right? I represent my elementary school and my first job. And so for me, there was always that appeal of being able to give back to the place that raised me and made me. But it's running for office is a leap of faith, much like serving in office is a leap of faith that you can make a difference, but running certainly is. And there's an old saying that goes around New York politics, and I've only heard it in New York politics. So I'm actually bringing it up on this podcast kind of as a test. Your listeners can write in if they've ever heard this outside New York, because everyone in New York has, but I've never heard someone outside that has, which is a little depressing, but I think it's sort of realistic when you lean into a campaign. People will say, write down your 10 friends the day before you declare, your 10 best friends, and write down your 10 best friends the day after the election, and 7 of them will be different. And I heard this again and again, that part of running for office is, some people that you thought would be there and some organizations that you thought would be there and some institutions that you thought would be there won't be, but also some people that you never thought would be there. And institutions and organizations will come through and be, way more supportive than you thought. I'm very lucky to say that while I experienced both of those, my list before and after were not quite as different. It was much more consistent in my 10. But the reason I bring that up is because when you're running for office, you are constantly asking people for things. It's 24 hours of, I need your vote, or I need your endorsement, or when you're fundraising, I need the resources in order to get this done. And many people who run are surprised by the reaction. And I think the best thing you can do when you are thinking about running for office, or, if in the future you ever want to run for office, the best thing is just to try to always carry yourself and behave as the person that you would want to be in office. Because my experience in running was, it was scary and it was terrifying and it had the ups and downs and it was a roller coaster. But I was far more surprised by how many people came out of the woodwork and said, you're the kind of person that I would want there. Like, that was an incredibly humbling and emotional experience. But the best advice I can give to people that are thinking about it is just carry yourself the way you would want someone in office to carry yourself, and you will be thrilled and surprised at how many people will latch onto that if and when you do declare.
That's smart advice. Yeah, if you can project the kind of leader you'll be, it makes it much easier for people to envision you in that role.
And to be clear, the way you would want them to be, not the way that you think they are. Not your stereotype of someone in office. It's not about pulling power moves and it's not that. It's how do you think people in office should behave that way?
I like that. How do you think campaigning and representing Manhattan is different from, any other legislators from other districts across the country?
It is and it isn't. Obviously, there are certain things that are perhaps more acute in Manhattan, but there's similar issues that are affecting everyone, right? The first thing that everyone from Manhattan jumps to is housing. But try telling anyone anywhere that housing's only an issue in Manhattan, right? The housing prices are an issue throughout the country, and they're rising quite rapidly. We think about our schools, we think about our park access, and we think about the health of people and having access to hospitals and doctors and services. There's a game that we've played at certain New Deal conferences, which is name an issue that only affects your state or your town or your municipality. And it turns out to be a much harder game than you think it is. I have routinely won that game by bringing up scaffolding. I think that is the issue that might only exist in Manhattan, that doesn't exist elsewhere. But if someone out there is dealing with a lot of scaffolding complaints, let me know, because we're still working on solving it here.
Perfect. I think, ours, I'd have to think of the specific surfing issue that would.
Yeah, that's great. We don't have surfing issues here, so that's a great example. Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, it's housing and budgets and potholes and all the things that go everywhere else. You're young, tech savvy. You've just come back from the Democratic National Convention. Tell me where you think the Democratic Party is in terms of embracing the next generation, embracing technology, embracing the future.
That's a great question. I think the Democratic Party is forward-looking in terms of where we need to go and what we need to do. And I'm using that term intentionally as opposed to embracing, because there's a lot of unanswered questions. There is so much more we could be doing with technology as a society. I tend to be, in particular, much more bullish than most people about what is already possible. And I think we haven't used everything that's already been invented to its maximum, while still worried about what the future holds and making sure that we're setting up the right incentive structures and the right regulation for where things could go. And I think the Democratic Party is being intentional in those trade-offs, right? You saw the president put out a executive order on a blueprint for AI safety that I think was very well received and very well researched. You've seen a lot of funding towards building the chips that are needed for this revolution, right? The Chips and Science Act, and even part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act has gone to more funding to help modernize and make best use of technology. So, this is not a time to stick our heads in the sand and hope things don't change. This is our time to lean in and to try to shape the future. And I think there's one party that is consistently engaged in that conversation and trying to shape the future, and perhaps another that is fighting old battles. And I think we need to be looking forward.
I want to ask you in our final question about your future. You're a talented guy. You have a lot of subject matter expertise, as well as expertise now in both the startups and government space. How do you think about how you allocate your years ahead to have that impact that you said drives you?
Well, one thing, Ryan, that I do is I listen to this podcast a lot, and I try to learn from other elected leaders. And I mean that seriously, because we can't do everything in the day, and you can serve in different roles in different ways. And that's often a trade-off of, do I want to go do something where I can focus a lot on legislation? Do I want to do something where I'm focused a lot on land use? Do I want to think about executive branch roles where it's the administration of and the implementation of how we do things? There's many, many ways to serve. I am always just guided by the question of, where can I have the most impact? And, at the end of my career, whenever that is, and some young whippersnapper calls me and says, hey, I'm thinking about running, what are my 3 bills or my 3 accomplishments or the 3 impacts I have that I know, I can say, hey, I had an impact. And that will always be what I'm chasing.
Love that. And I love that the honorable profession is a little mini life coach. in that decision. We love having you part of New Deal. I think New Deal is getting out, and New Deal leaders are getting out in front on AI, and having you in that network to brainstorm with our other leaders about how we take advantage of these big opportunities and reduce some of the risks is huge. And so thank you for taking the time today, and thank you for being part of New Deal.
Thank you for all you do to highlight these stories throughout the country, and I really want to thank the New Deal leadership or New Deal network for what they have done to train us and to bring us together and allow us to have these conversations. The forums where you can talk across cities, across states on what is working, what is not, how we move things forward are so rare and so valuable. And New Deal Leaders is really the preeminent organization when I think about that.
Thank you. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at New Deal for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.